talk about her roles with the Central Conference of American Rabbis, in the press office, in strategic planning, and now as the chief executive. You could mention that as you're researching and looking for the right Hebrew poem, you find her marks and fingers and reviews in the scholarship of Hebrew poetry. Or for me, one of the most meaningful ways of introducing Rabbi Person is by saying that earlier in the middle, or I'll say the beginning of the pandemic, as High Holy Days were drawing near, not only did I receive a beautiful email talking about reinventing that fire in the woods in the right way and in the right place, interpreted for our time, which brought so much meaning for me, and then I shared with our family service crowd over the High Holy Days. But also, I, and I'm sure almost every rabbi in North America, received in a moment of darkness and personal struggle, a check-in, a personal email from Rabbi Person, which really buoyed the spirits and reminded us that as rabbis and as colleagues, as friends with those that we see in front of us and that we serve, really, it's the personal connection that really counts. And so thank you for that email in a moment of darkness, Rabbi Person, and thank you for being here with us in order to celebrate our 100th year of joining and being part of officially the Reform movement.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that beautiful introduction. And I'm really just so honored to be here with you all today. I wish I could be there in person, of course, but it's really great to be at Holy Blossom, even virtually. I'm here this morning to talk about 100 years of Reform rabbinic leadership, and I'm humbled to do so at this congregation that has been the source of so many of our greatest and most influential rabbis. Rabbi Brickner, Rabbi Isserman, Rabbi Eisendrath, Rabbi Feinberg, Rabbi Plaut, Rabbi Fields, Rabbi Murmer, Rabbi Moskowitz, and now Rabbi Spolansky, Rabbi Helfman, and Rabbi Goodman. And of course, you are also so lucky to have your amazing Cantor Rosen. It's my privilege to hear you today. It is really an honor to be speaking about rabbinic leadership in a place that has nurtured such tremendous rabbinic leadership. But before we can talk about 100 years, we actually have to go back even a bit farther and set the stage. Many centuries ago, as we've read this morning, Abraham set out on a journey of identity formation and faith development. He set out into the unknown, determined to follow the vision of bringing monotheism and devotion to Adonai to people who had no idea what he was talking about. He was an original, a man committed to a cause, a hopeless dreamer whose dreams actually took shape and created a pathway forward. As Rabbi Helfman said, an idol breaker. Now I'm going to stretch this analogy perhaps a bit further than it should be stretched, but bear with me, because many, many centuries later, a man named Isaac arose to lead our people. Not Abraham's son Isaac, but a modern day Isaac. As Rabbi Spolansky said, a descendant of Abraham and Sarah, who would continue to build on their legacy. The organization I lead, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, is the professional organization of Reform rabbis. And aware as I am that I'm in Canada this morning, don't be fooled by the words American in our title. In fact, today we count within our ranks 2,200 rabbis spanning the United States and Canada, Central and South America, Europe, the former Soviet Union, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, South Africa, and of course, Israel. I'm honored that Rabbi Spolansky serves on our board, and we owe so much to those who have served as our presidents, including some of your rabbis, Rabbi Brickner and Rabbi Plaut. In addition to hearing a bit about your own rabbis, I'm going to introduce you this morning to some other rabbis with whom you might not be as familiar. So we owe our very existence to the indomitable Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, that Abrahamic figure who founded the CAR in 1889. and who also founded Hebrew Union College and the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, now the URJ, led, of course, at one time by your own Rabbi Eisendrath. Wise was, by some reports, a crazy dreamer. He was, like Abraham, a solitary man with a vision of what could be, and an idol breaker. His wilderness was not the desert of the Middle East, but rather the cities and prairies and towns across North America. He had a wild vision of an indigenous native Reform Judaism that would train and employ rabbis to serve its own homegrown form of Reform Judaism rather than an import from Europe. He wanted to separate New World Reform Judaism from European Reform, and his dream led him to believe that in order to do so, a new structure with proper institutional scaffolding needed to be built. In 1871, while Wise was still considering exactly how to create a North American rabbinate, he wrote the following. In the name of God and Israel, a rabbi must be a bearer of light and truth, of reason's choice gifts and conscience's holy lessons. Rabbis must be people of peace and goodwill. They must conciliate wherever they can, but must always be strong in the declaration of truth, without fear or favor. One of Wise's aims in creating a local rabbinic organization was to give rabbis a community in which to learn and help each other, to help be bearers of light and truth. But his more earthly, practical goal in doing so was to build a structure in which rabbis could come together and create an English language Reform prayer book for the Reform synagogues or temples that were starting to spring up in the New World. Out of that vision came, after admittedly some false starts, the Union Prayer Book, the first official publication of the CCR in 1892. Today, we have grown into a worldwide organization with a mission of supporting rabbis and thereby strengthening the communities in which they serve. We do still publish prayer books, and those prayer books are used in the vast majority of Reform synagogues throughout North America, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, uniting us through shared liturgy. And we also publish many other print and digital resources for rabbis, cantors, and their communities, including Haggadot. We offer programming for members of synagogue communities featuring our authors and publications. And I'm going to just digress here for a moment of personal privilege. Before I was the chief executive of the CCR, I was the publisher of CCR Press. And before that, I was the publisher of URJ Press. When URJ Press folded about 5 years ago, CCR took on some of the major publications of the URJ Press, which is all just to say that I had the privilege while at URJ Press of working closely with two of your rabbis, both Rabbi Plaut and Rabbi Fields. And I'm very proud that both of their Torah commentaries and Rabbi Plaut's Haftarah commentary are once again part of the rich collection of Reform resources now made available through the CCR. I treasure the relationships that I was lucky enough to have with each of them as their editors, and count both of them among my teachers. Our mission has broadened since Wise's original thinking on what a rabbinic organization should be. In addition to the books that we publish, today we serve rabbis in a myriad of ways. We offer a robust program of continuing professional education so that rabbis can keep updating their skills, gain new tools, and deepen their learning. We run an annual conference as well as in-person and online trainings and learnings. We run the Reform Placement Commission and office, helping rabbis and congregations make matches. We offer professional guidance to rabbis and sometimes to synagogues as well on a large variety of topics. And because rabbis are also human beings, and because being a rabbi is wonderful but can also be challenging, we offer personal help for rabbis, including support groups and one-on-one counseling. In addition to the work we do on a daily basis for rabbis and their communities, since our early days as an organization, the CCR has enabled rabbis to bring their Jewish values into the public sphere. This is part of our work that we call amplifying the rabbinic voice. Throughout our history, we have done that through the publication of resolutions, speeches, and statements, serving as a platform for the rabbinic perspective on issues of the day, as well as through action and involvement in a range of issues. In 1912, at a time of tremendous unrest over labor practices and the rise of unions, and when Jewish business and factory owners were in conflict with Jewish labor organizers, Rabbi Samuel Schulman, then the president of CCR, pronounced, What greater exaltation of the religion could there be than for the rabbis so to act with courage and uprightness as to win the confidence of both laborer and employer and be the makers of peace? Rabbi Shulman believed that the CCR had a role in mediating this conflict because he saw this issue of the day as one involving Jewish ethics and also relations between Jews. And he hoped that Wise's vision of rabbis as people of peace and goodwill could prevail. Today, his image of the rabbi as mediator is one that still lives with us, calling us to find ways to encourage civil discourse in our synagogues and communities as the conversation becomes more and more divisive. Not too long after that, in 1921, Rabbi Leo Franklin declared, as the then president of CCR, immigration legislation cannot be a matter of indifference to us as Jews, for unfortunately, among the victims of these forms of persecution are vast numbers of our co-religionists. Our tradition teaches that though we live in a broken world, we are fundamentally optimists, never giving up on the premise that our actions and voices can make a difference, not standing by while others suffer, whether other Jews, as identified here by Franklin, or any other people, remains a tenet of Reform Judaism today and galvanizes the rabbinate of the 21st century to continue to speak out and act on issues of justice. In 1953, at the height of McCarthyism in the United States, then CCR President Rabbi Joseph Fink wrote, "Of all groups in our land, the one group most concerned with freedom must be the clergy. Its members have not only the privilege as citizens, but also the professional duty as ministers of God to speak their hearts freely and courageously and constantly." That idea has continued to be a trope throughout the Reform Rabbinate in these many years since our founding, that it is part of our job as rabbis to speak up and speak out, that to be complacent is to be complicit. In an environment like the one we find ourselves in today, in which the conversation about faith is often dominated by fundamentalist Christians, it is the role of Reform rabbis to provide a different voice and a faith perspective. And it is the role of the CCR to help get that voice out into the marketplace of ideas and into the media to show that there is such a thing as being a progressive person of faith. Our struggles in 2020 might not be the same as the ones identified by Rabbi Shulman or Rabbi Franklin in the early 20th century, or Rabbi Fink in 1953, but they are not so very different. Our vision for a better, more peaceful future is still the same. And in these past 100 years, our rabbis have continued to be involved in issues of human rights and social justice, from aligning with the great boycotts in the 1970s to working to combat racism, to name just a few examples. Your own Rabbi Isserman was chair of our Justice and Peace Commission, through which he organized rabbis to fight racism in the 1940s. Holy Blossom's Rabbi Feinberg was outspoken on many issues, including speaking out against the internment of Japanese Canadians in 1942. And Rabbi Eisendrath, while he was head of the UAHC, famously marched for civil rights with Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. The rabbis of the CCR have always been leaders of change within Reform Judaism, as well as within the wider world. I know it won't surprise you that the Reform Rabbinate had, at best, mixed feelings about Zionism prior to the establishment of the state in 1948. However, in that same year, after the state was established, CCR President Rabbi Abraham Feldman made a bold statement, declaring to his fellow Reform rabbis, "It seems to me that in the presence of the fait accompli, the half-century of debate on the subject of Zionism shall now come to an end. The democracy of Israel and Eretz Yisrael will forge its own destiny. We shall help them where and when we can, and rightly so. They will have our aid whilst they need aid, and our brotherly support as they require it. But the political controversy among us here should now be adjourned." This declaration was followed only 3 years later by Rabbi Philip Bernstein, the next president of the CCR, who stated, "First, we must and will help Israel in every way we can. Second, we will not rest content until the disabilities suffered by non-Orthodox Judaism in Israel be replaced by full equality of status." The Reform Rabbinate understood that it was our responsibility to stand with and support Israel, and also specifically to stand with and support our fellow Reform Jews in Israel. And this congregation and your rabbis, including Rabbi Marmer, who was the first chair of Artsenu, the International Movement of Reform Zionism, and Rabbi Splansky, have been leaders in this work. Today, that support takes many forms, but one of my personal favorites is that under normal circumstances, we run a trip every winter to Israel for rabbis, a highly subsidized trip, and we do it because we want to keep our rabbis as up to date as possible on that ever-changing place that is Israel. We want them to continue to deepen their relationship with the country. We want them to form relationships with our Israeli colleagues, and we want to encourage them to bring their communities to Israel. We've led changes in other areas as well, resulting in shifts in the wider Jewish community. The first came about in 1972, when HEC ordained its first woman student as a rabbi, Rabbi Sally Prezand, and she became the first woman to join the CCAR. Then in 1990, the CCAR formally welcomed gay and lesbian rabbis within its membership, and in 2000 passed a resolution officially allowing its member rabbis to officiate at same-sex marriages. Liturgical change has gone hand in hand with those changes, leading to the use of non-gendered God language in our prayer books. There has been a new burst of liturgy developed in the last 30 years that continues until today, with the development of new liturgy to encompass new understandings of sexual and gender identity, new family compositions, new kinds of ritual moments, and new ways of approaching Jewish practice. Our rabbis are leading the charge in developing new forms of connection to ancient text as well, including feminist interpretation as well as Musar study. In the years that CCR has been in existence, it has fostered an incredibly talented group of rabbis who have been the leaders in North American Reform Judaism. What I've described here has only scratched the surface of the many, many contributions made by Reform rabbis, like those who have led this very congregation. They have founded organizations, written books, led marches, created liturgy, advanced scholarship, and inspired and touched millions of lives. And your rabbis here at Holy Blossom have led the way in much of this work, as you know. In 1956, when he was president of the CCAR, Rabbi Brickner gave his fellow rabbis a glowing report of the future of the Reform Rabbinate in his presidential address, saying, "The forces making for Jewishness are greater today than they have ever been. Native-born Jewish scholars are coming to the fore who did not go to the European academies to be trained. Scholarly works are coming off the presses that are comparable to those produced in Europe." For Rabbi Brickner, from whom what I understand was the rabbi at Holy Blossom who brought you into the Reform movement, this was Wise's vision coming to life, the bursting forth of a beautiful native Reform Judaism to meet the needs of the ever-growing population here in North America. And how prescient, given that your congregation was going to produce so many of these scholars, whose work would become pillars of our North American Reform canon, including, of course, Rabbi Fields and Rabbi Plout. In 1890, at the first CCR convention, Rabbi Wise said the following in his opening speech: "And here are 90 American rabbis, peacefully and hopefully united, to be now and forever the nucleus, the center of gravity to all colleagues who are desirous to work in the name of God for the house of Israel and the sublime cause of humanity. Here we are, the largest number of American rabbis ever united on this continent, to unfurl to the breeze the banner of one God and one Israel. A bright morn star has appeared on the horizon of our holy cause with the success of this central conference." It is likely that if Rabbi Wise were to come back today, he would not recognize today's rabbinate. Those 90 rabbis of which Wise speaks were all Ashkenazi men. And now in 2020, our membership is more diverse than ever before and will continue to be even more so in the years to come. Our membership is now 1/3 women, with that number rising every year. We're still mostly Ashkenazi, but we count within our ranks some from Sephardic backgrounds and some who do not identify as white. We include many who did not grow up Reform and a good number who have one parent who was not born Jewish. We are international, as I noted earlier, with members all over the world. We have rabbis who serve in congregations big and small, rabbis in the American military, rabbis serving in a wide range of healthcare facilities, rabbi educators working in or running schools, Hillel rabbis and chaplains on campuses, rabbis in academia, and entrepreneurial rabbis. We have a range of sexual and racial identities that is surely going to increase in the years to come. And yet, even with all those changes, there is much from Wise's original vision that remains the same. The Reform Rabbinate of the future will surely be significantly more diverse than what the rabbinate looks like today. Rabbis will need to equip themselves with new skills and new toolboxes. They will come into the rabbinate with a wider range of prior learning. The career path of the past, with steady advancement from assistant rabbi to senior rabbi, is already no sure thing, and even the rabbis of today must consider different ways of working and supporting themselves and their families. And yet, we are still connected to Wise's original vision. In leading the way into uncharted territory, Abraham became God's partner in working toward the world that he wanted to see on earth. So it was with Isaac Mayer Wise, and so it is with us, as we continue to strive to be those bearers of light, those bright morn stars on the horizon of Wise's vision. Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.